since it seems to be what everybody's talking about, we'll start with COVID and the pandemic. Um, First, let me ask Annie, what was your reaction to hearing that the president had tested positive for COVID?
You know, it's funny, I heard Vice President Biden say this. I had the exact same reaction. It didn't surprise me at all. You know, he has flaunted the science and the precautions from the beginning. And I guess the only thing that surprised me, I would have thought that he would have gotten it more at those big rallies without masks and that kind of thing, just as much as he's been traveling outside the bubble of the White House. I guess I was a little shocked that it was actually an event at the White House, literally in the Rose Garden. You know, I've been to events there, and the idea that they would just bring in, looked like well over 100 people from outside, and that they were outdoor and indoor events. And we now can tell from the pictures that they flaunted all of the CDC precautions. People weren't wearing masks. And in fact, they were hugging each other and greeting each other and had very close contact. And now I think we're up to at least 11 people that have tested positive from that event, with introducing and nominating Amy Coney Barrett to the US Supreme Court. I call it the supreme irony that that became the super spreader event. And it's worse than that, because now it's also all through the White House staff. So Hope Hicks and the most recent being the communications person, McEnany, and her staff. So now there are multiple layers of staff, people whose names we would not recognize, that have tested positive. So it really has become, the White House itself has become a hotspot for COVID-19. And I've referred to it, I'll just add this. I did an interview on WMUR last Friday where I used the expression, "This is a threat to our democracy." And that has now played out in the 4 or 5 days since that interview, that I believe this is a threat to our democracy.
Well, fortunately, as you mentioned, you have yourself a negative test, and not all of your colleagues in Congress can say that at this point.
No, I think it's up to about a dozen US senators that have either tested positive or are in quarantine because of their exposure. And this is probably the appropriate place to say, my Republican colleagues have not, over the course of the past 6 months, taken these precautions seriously. And including in the Senate, the Republicans continued to have a weekly luncheon indoors in close quarters without masks. And I think that also has become its own type of super spreader event from my understanding and what I'm reading in the press.
So it is a very serious thing still. We're clearly not completely past it. As a lawmaker, what would you propose Congress do, or what would you put forth to try to turn things around in terms of the public health and economically?
Right. So they're intertwined, and the way you've asked the question, you recognize that. Back in March and April, when this first started, my team and I put together what we call a roadmap to recovery, where we address both the public health and the economic fallout. And the way I describe it to people, our goal was to tackle the public health crisis and avoid a complete economic collapse. That's where we started. The first few cases, I can remember the governor calling us each time there was a positive case. The very first case, we were all together with him at a press conference at the New Hampshire Hospital Association on preparation. And I feel as though we worked very well together. Congress moved very quickly. And what my roadmap talked about was the public health uh, focus, which is essentially testing, ramping up testing, contact tracing of each positive test, and then tracing back to who they may have exposed. Isolation and quarantine, which is if you have been exposed, you need to stay away from other people. And if you have a positive test, you completely need to isolate from anyone, even members of your own family. And I talked about something called supported isolation, so that we don't rely on a presumption that we might make that people can isolate safely in their home. But if they can't afford that, or if their home is more crowded, that we offer that in, that the government pay, whether it's hotel. In the end, the governor went the route of having the hotels available. And then what I'm working on, what I'm very focused on now, is the vaccine. I serve on the health subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And our entire focus is on making sure that we have a safe and effective vaccine, and that vaccine has the confidence and credibility for confidence from the public. And I'm very worried. We can get into that a little more detail, but I'm very, very worried because the President of the United States is the biggest threat to that vaccine right now by his conversations, his references to rushing the vaccine before the election and trying to deliver that to the American people in a political way, when in fact the science is that it won't be available before the election, and we need to wait and be patient. And then the flip side of this roadmap to recovery was the economic side. And I think in New Hampshire, we've done quite well on both parts of this, but the Congress responded very quickly with the CARES Act, and we have brought $4.2 billion with a B to New Hampshire for aid to our hospitals and healthcare providers to make sure that they were safe and they could keep the doors open and continue to treat people, not just COVID patients, but heart attacks and car accidents and babies and everything else. Stimulus checks to individuals and families, so that if they were out of work, or that they would not, they'd be able to pay their bills. Unemployment, the supplemental federal unemployment, $600 a week additional, to make sure that families would not lose their housing, would not, that they would stay fed, that they would be safe, as there's businesses shut down during the spring, the shutdown. And then the all-important PPP, with support for small businesses that did have to shut down. We call it the Paycheck Protection Program. And this has been very interesting. There were 24,000 loans in New Hampshire. That's what we were working on all spring, making sure to get the word out. Chris Pappas and I had 13 town hall meetings to make sure that everybody knew about all these benefits and how to get the financial support. Of the 24,000 loans to small businesses in New Hampshire, it turns out 22,000 were under $150,000. And part of what we just voted on last week in the House before we recessed to come home was to relieve those $150,000 loans without a lot of red tape, that they would become grants with a pretty minimal filing. So that's going to have a huge impact in New Hampshire. And it already has economically. A lot of businesses were able to shut down from March to the 1st of July and then reopen their doors safely. Obviously the hospitality and tourism was hit the hardest, but I think many of them have made their way back, first with the outdoor seating and the terraces and that, and then now more and more safely with separation and distance and masks and such, bringing that indoors. So that's sort of the package that I put forward as to how to go about this. And then in terms of where we go from here, I think we are doing a great job. I think New Hampshire's a really good lesson for the country. We didn't politicize it. As I say, the Democratic federal delegation worked well with the governor behind the scenes to get these funds out, to get people the resources that they need. And then people in New Hampshire have taken it very, very seriously. If they were able to work from home, they continued to. Um, we did go up to 16% unemployment at the height of it, but now we're back down under 7% unemployment. And they wear the masks when they go out. If they are out and about working or shopping, they're very, very careful. And for the most part, people, if they socialize, it's to have a few friends or family over on the deck, seated outside. A lot of people, apparently you can't buy a fire pit anymore because people have gone out and bought those all up so that they could extend the socializing into the fall. But I think people here are very careful. And if that was happening across the country, we'd have a very different situation than where we are. Regretfully, the president and some Republican governors politicized COVID-19, politicized the very mask. The idea that the president, COVID positive, comes out of the hospital and comes back to the White House, and the first thing he does with great fanfare is take the mask off. That's outrageous. What about the people that are working in the White House? What about the Secret Service that their job is to cover him? They're not safe. We know from the CDC that it's an airborne, very, very contagious disease.
So then to get back to the question, is there something at this point moving forward that Congress can do? Do you see for example, the need for more aid, more spending, more stimulus?
Yes, and it's interesting because while New Hampshire is doing well, we're starting to see an uptick of cases. I'm very concerned about the winter months when we are, have to be indoors. And also other states across the country are not doing well. So we passed last week what we call the HEROES Act, and that extends the PPP to companies that need it. It extends the unemployment insurance to people who are still not able to go back to work. And there's another round of stimulus checks to make sure that the economy continues to go forward. I'm very worried about people that losing their housing heading into the fall and the winter. We've seen a tremendous uptick in food insecurity, and so this HEROES Act addresses the food insecurity. And then the biggest part of it, and this is where what's been the bone of contention in the negotiations between the House and the Senate, we believe our version, the House version, includes reimbursement to state and local governments. So the state of New Hampshire, not just for responding to COVID, but for the lost revenue. And for us in particular, that is the rooms and meals tax. We had a 90% drop in tourism and hospitality, and a huge hole in our budget for loss of rooms and meals tax between March and when tourism started to come back in the summer. Excuse me. For the towns, it's real property taxes, people who have been out of work that haven't been able to pay their real property taxes. And for New Hampshire, the bill passed in the House would mean $800 million flowing from the federal government to New Hampshire. And if we don't do that, that is going to be a tremendous hole in the state budget that is going to cause severe pain when the legislature gets back and does their budget for next year. So the governor supports this. We've been encouraging him to encourage his Republican colleagues in the Senate and in the White House to pass this important package and get it signed into law and get the relief to the American people that they need.
What do you think should be done to prepare for a future pandemic? Hopefully that won't happen, but
No, it's an excellent question. We can't assume that it won't happen. I look back on this. Our first hearing in our health subcommittee was at the end of February with Secretary Azar talking about the pandemic. And what I said in my questions to the secretary, to me, the most important sort of resource, if you will, but the most important aspect going forward was transparency, trust, and credibility. That we needed the trust of the American people in the information that the government was going to provide from scientists. Dr. Fauci has incredibly high credibility. He still does, thank God. Dr. Redfield at the CDC, the head of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Hahn. I mean, all of these people are working very, very hard to keep us safe. But the president does not believe the science and continues to try to diminish the severity of this highly contagious disease that's killed 209,000 Americans, over 400 right here in New Hampshire. So to me, we need to invest in our public health infrastructure. My cousin is an infectious disease doctor at the CDC, and he was involved in Ebola and ending the threat of Ebola from West Africa. And he's been sending me a lot of information about contact tracing. Contact tracing is going better in African countries than here in America. And it's because we don't have the leadership and we don't have the public health infrastructure. We haven't invested in that over time to keep Americans safe. And I think we need new leadership. That's what the election is all about. We need leadership that believes in science and will keep Americans, you and your family, safe.
Is there anything besides infrastructure that you think would be useful to prepare for a, as yet unseen, something 10 years, 20 years down the line?
Yes. And the main point that I need to make is it didn't have to be this way in America. So, for example, this president dismantled our infectious disease infrastructure. I use that word infrastructure. What I mean is that there are roles of scientists, there are bureaucracies that have been set up to be prepared. And one of the things that they had dismantled was the international cooperation so that we would be prepared working with other countries around the world when a new pandemic arises. And so what happened here was we didn't have the communication and the cooperation that we should have had with China. And even when you look back on it, all through the month of January, our public officials were saying, oh, poor China, like that's something separate from us. And then all through February, oh, poor Spain, poor Italy, not realizing that this train is headed straight for us and we need to prepare. And then you look at the supply chain problems that arose. I can remember a conversation with the people at Cheshire Medical Center, just frantic, trying to find PPE in the middle of March and the end of March. And they had not, nobody had said, you should be stockpiling this. And the federal stockpile was inadequate. That's something that we definitely need to work on, is the federal stockpile. It was inadequate and the materials were dated and were not, some of them not even helpful. That's something our committee is working on. We need to be working on vaccine research and being prepared so that we can get that started right away and move quickly in the processing, not the research itself, but you don't want to rush that, but in the manufacturing and the preparation. And we're doing that right now so that this vaccine, once we know which one is safe and effective, can be mass produced and distributed equitably quickly. So there's many, many steps that need to be taken right now and could be taken to prepare us for the next pandemic.
So turning to another public health issue, and that's opioids, which are continuing to take a toll on our communities here in New Hampshire. What do you think remains to be done to continue the work on substance use disorder and to try to help people who are suffering with it?
Well, thank you for that. That's something that I've been working on now for the past 8 years. I am the chair, the founder, and the co-chair of the Bipartisan Opioid Task Force in Congress. And we have close to 100 members working together. And each biennium, we've put together a agenda of bipartisan legislation to tackle all different aspects of prevention, treatment, long-term recovery, and then, of course, working with law enforcement. And one of the issues that I'm very focused on is the recidivism that happens with people that are involved in our criminal justice system. And it took me a while to understand what the problem was, but now that I've identified it, I want to fix it, which is that 50 years ago, when Congress created Medicaid, they had a big, big loophole. And that is that there is, it's called the Medicaid inmate exclusion. And as soon, the day that someone goes into incarceration, whether it's the county jail, the state prison, the federal penitentiary, the day they go in behind bars, they lose their health coverage. And we rely solely on the county budget, the state budget, the federal budget. And for the most part, healthcare inside the walls is, and it's an infirmary. You know, you break an arm, they'll fix it, but otherwise you're on your own. So for 50 years, all across this country, people with mental health and substance use issues, and most people in our criminal justice system have both. They have co-occurring illness, as high as 90%. They get no treatment on the inside. And then they come out and we all act shocked that they haven't overcome their addiction. We're not shocked that they still have diabetes. We shouldn't be shocked that they still have addiction. And so what happens, we're not very good at the transition when they come out, getting them to services, and they end up back with dealing, you know, with their addiction, getting involved in law enforcement again, criminal justice system, back in. And we, the taxpayers and our communities, live with sometimes a 70% recidivism rate. So I have legislation that would eliminate that Medicaid inmate exclusion, that would bring healthcare inside so that they can get medically assisted treatment and get their mental health treatment and use the time inside to get their lives back together so that when they come out, they can get a job, they can get housing, they can take care of their families, and they can be solid citizens again. And it turns out that it works. And I learned about this from Sullivan County. It's now in Merrimack County, a guy named Ross Cunningham, who brought this model and dropped the recidivism rate down to as low as 18%. And even that was mainly parole violations. So we're using the wrong system, where it's a public health issue, opioid and other drug addiction. Substance use disorder is the term they use. And we should have a public health response. And instead we have a criminal justice response that's very, very expensive and not effective.
So, Annie, what that would help deal with inmates who are in that situation. What about others?
Well, the whole point is that most of what is happening in terms of drugs in our community is a revolving door through the criminal justice system. And so if you diminish the use of the drugs, then you don't have the same market for drug dealers to be wanting to peddle their wares here in New Hampshire. In terms of opioids, the other thing we have been successful at, to a certain extent, in New Hampshire, we learned that we had twice the national average of opioid prescribing. And I've never understood why that was true, but we tackled that. And the working with the healthcare provider community, the surgeons and the people that were prescribing at such a high rate, we have dramatically reduced the use of opioid medication, both here and across the country. And a lot of our legislation has been focused on that. And then making treatment much more readily available to people, eliminating the barriers to treatment that people find, and investing in research, both in the pain management side so that people weren't prescribing such addictive medication, and in the treatment side with medically assisted treatment, learning what was effective treatment for substance use disorder and how to keep people on that treatment and involved in therapy. Although it's incredible that still to this day, some of the most effective means are AA, NA programs that, you know, don't involve medication and don't even involve the healthcare delivery system. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is really important, I'm distressed about this. There's an article in the New Yorker that is a big expose about Purdue Pharma. We know now that big pharma, in particular this company Purdue, was peddling the medication. They were, they had all kinds of incentive structures, and they were literally pushing the medication on the healthcare providers, particularly the surgeons, that were then rewarded for pushing out very high dosages. We did make another change that was important, which is that this is a little convoluted, but it was tied into the quality assurance for Medicare. And it turned out that they were, one of the criteria they were using to judge whether a physician was doing a good job was whether or not his patients were still in pain, which is pretty subjective. And so the physicians, and I learned this from meeting over the years with surgeons, they were literally just prescribing more and more medication because they wanted to bring down the pain so that they would get the higher scores on their quality reports. So they were saying, look, rather than giving you 10 pills, which is what you might need, I'm going to send you home with 30 or 60 or 90. And it turned out this medication was highly addictive, and people were unsuspecting getting hooked on it. This happened to my own brother from a series of hip surgeries out in the West Coast. And it's been devastating for our family and devastating for him. Luckily, he got treatment and he's doing well right now. But you know this, over in Cheshire County, that's where I first learned about it. This is probably close to 10 years ago, going to a meeting, a community meeting of families that were coming together saying, this is devastating. We need help.
I'd like to pivot to a different issue that also kind of has some tie-ins with the criminal justice system, which is racial equality in the U.S. What can be done by Congress to better improve racial equality in the country, and, you know, specifically here in New Hampshire? And also, do you believe that there is systemic racism in the way that law enforcement is trained and the way it operates?
Well, absolutely. I believe there's implicit bias throughout our society, and I think that's what we're all learning a great deal about. And it shouldn't have taken this long, and it shouldn't take people dying at the hands of the police for us to be addressing it. But you know, now we're here in this moment and we can move forward. So just going back to this legislation, I've co-sponsored it with Cory Booker in the Senate. And we talk about opioids because that's what has hit New Hampshire. But this legislation is very, very relevant to what has happened with race here in our country. Because if you just substitute opioids for any other drug, in particular crack cocaine, we locked up an entire generation of African American, particularly males, but females as well, without treatment for their underlying substance use disorder. And then we act, again, shocked when they come out that they're going back to that. We created an entire economy of drug sales that led to violence and increased, you know, use of weapons. You look at Chicago, the murder rate out there. So I'm working with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus to unravel this quote unquote war on drugs has not only not kept our communities healthy and well and safe, but it also has added to this criminalization and gangs and this whole illicit dark market of drugs and weapons. And I think that that has contributed to our communities being sort of driven apart. That and then the other thing that happened is that it seems there's less and less people living near each other. Cory Booker's story that he told over and over in New Hampshire about his own family's experience of redlining and not being able to buy a home. I learned recently from a friend of mine who's in the New Hampshire State Senate, Melanie LeVake, and we were doing a online discussion on race with the Nashua Police Department. And she said that had happened to her family in Nashua in the 1960s. Her father came to work at Digital and couldn't buy a home in Nashua, and his colleagues had to buy the home and then sell it back to them. So my own feeling is that Congress can do a lot on civil rights. We've just passed our policing bill on training, implicit bias, on data collection so that people understand, they have the facts. And I'm actually very proud in New Hampshire. I was just speaking the other day to the safety commissioner, Commissioner Quinn, about the group that came together. It had community involvement. It came out of the George Floyd murder, but it included people that had been involved in this. I know Chief Carignan down in Nashua for 5 years had a conversation going with community leaders about race. And there were 48 recommendations, and all of them were unanimous, and all of them have been accepted about implicit bias and training and data collection. It also included, they've changed the curriculum at the police standards here in New Hampshire. So it's both a community problem and a police problem, and I think we need to tackle both. But thank you for bringing it up. It's really important.
When we talked with you 2 years ago, we were talking about the Me Too movement at that time, which was very much in the public conversation. It's not so much in the public conversation right now. Do you think that needs to change?
Well, it hasn't gone away for sure. And I am, again, proud that I'm the founder and co-chair of the Bipartisan Task Force to End Sexual Violence. And I think we covered in that conversation 2 years ago, I'm a survivor of sexual assault myself. And I've worked with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Again, we have probably 40 or 50 colleagues that my co-chairs are Ms. Jackie Spear from California, who's led on this issue for a long time, and then Dave Joyce from Ohio and John Katko from New York, the Republicans, who both have experienced themselves in criminal justice. We just had an online roundtable discussion last week about this with people that are dealing with sex trafficking. And during COVID, it's chilling, but they had a 40% increase last spring, winter and spring, post-COVID during the shutdown of increased incidents of child sexual abuse at the hotline that they have. I should say on opioids, sadly, a 30% increase on opioid overdoses and opioid deaths, both here in New Hampshire and nationally. So we continue to try to keep this front and center in the conversation. We have a lot of common ground in a bipartisan way on sex trafficking, and we've passed a number of bills. And you probably saw some of the headlines about the arrests recently of, sadly, of child victims of sex trafficking picked up in states like Georgia and North Dakota. But I stay in close contact with the Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We worked hard to get special funding in the CARES package and in the HEROES Act to make sure that, that there were resources available both to law enforcement for interdiction and to our community partners for treatment, prevention, treatment, and recovery. It's quite similar to the opioids in that sense. And last, I'll just say it's been very challenging, the issue about reopening schools. And I want to make sure that teachers are safe, and obviously that students and their families are safe. And I think, you know, probably the best option is the one that most of the towns in New Hampshire have taken, which is some kind of a hybrid, so that people who have to stay home can continue to have their education, but some people can participate at least part of the time in person. But one of the reasons that I feel strongly about trying to see young people in person is from my conversations with the therapists and social workers in the field, who are very concerned that we don't have eyes on these children outside of their family. We presume that the shutdown was inconvenient, but, you know, was safe for people, but you can't assume that if your predator is the person in the home with you. And that was why we had this tremendous uptick in sexual assault and child sexual assault cases, and domestic violence as well. So it's an important topic. We're continuing to work on it. There have been some important books. Our task force did a roundtable, for example, the woman who was the Emily Doe, her name is Chanel Miller, out in Stanford, California, wrote a book about her experience, and we had her on in a roundtable. But it's an important topic. It's tied into a different topic about women that I'm very well aware of right now with COVID, which is that 1 in every 4 women is either cutting back on work or leaving the workforce completely. I sometimes worry that COVID is going to set women back 30 years in our society, because the primary burden of daycares being closed, childcare, schools being closed, although there are fathers who certainly have stepped up during COVID, the primary burden has fallen to women, and women are dropping out of the workforce at alarming numbers. And that will have an impact on our economy, both on the personal household economy for certain, but in terms of hiring the best and the brightest. If you're a newspaper in Keene, New Hampshire, or if you're a congressional office, or anyone else in this state or across the country.
I would like to pivot to a broader discussion about healthcare. Right now, the Affordable Care Act is kind of up in the air in terms of what its future is going to be like. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about two different scenarios of what would happen if the Supreme Court, takes some sort of action to overturn the ACA, or, if it stays in place, what additional things could be done to further enhance and expand who receives health coverage in the U.S.?
Great. Thank you so much for that question, because that's front of mind for voters. When voters are polled, that is the absolute number one question that comes up. They're very concerned about their access to affordable, quality health care. So number one that we need to understand is that the sole primary reason that the Senate, Mitch McConnell, and the president want to rush this nomination of Amy Coney Barrett for the seat vacated by the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is that the hearing, the oral argument on the case to totally repeal the Affordable Care Act is already set, and the date is November 10, 1 week after the election. So they know that they want Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court as the pivotal vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Justice Roberts is turning out not to be the pivotal vote. He thinks that we should keep it and the legislature should fix it. I think Congress can go a long way, particularly with new leadership in the Senate and in the White House, to shore up the Affordable Care Act, to expand it, to make sure that anyone that's currently falling through the cracks is covered, and to protect the coverage for particularly pre-existing conditions. And I think this is the most important thing in this entire election for voters to understand. The Republicans have tried for 4 years to completely repeal the Affordable Care Act. That means no more guarantee of coverage for pre-existing conditions all the way through the alphabet: allergies and asthma and cancer and diabetes, whatever the condition. 600,000 people in New Hampshire, almost half the population, have pre-existing conditions, and they would not be guaranteed access to health insurance. To eliminate the coverage for people up to age 26 on their parents' plan, to eliminate coverage for people who hit the cap. We don't even really remember this anymore. 10 years ago, insurance companies had a cap, and if you had a chronic condition and used a lot of health insurance, you'd hit the cap and you wouldn't be covered for your health needs after that age or that cap. And the list goes on of protections that are built into the Affordable Care Act. And the most important thing is the Republicans have no solution. The president just always says, oh, it's 2 weeks away, it's 2 weeks away. It doesn't exist. And the reason I know that they don't care about coverage for pre-existing conditions is that I had the honor on my health subcommittee to carry the legislation that we passed in the House this year to guarantee coverage for pre-existing conditions. And my Republican colleagues voted against it. So they honestly do not care. And I think the voters deserve to understand the difference.
Can we talk a little bit about access to mental health care? Is that something that should be treated the same as physical ailments, or do you have a different idea of how to address that?
Absolute parity. And this is something that it was before my time. I don't even understand how we got so far off track to treat the brain differently from the rest of the body. Behavioral health is critically important to the well-being of families, of students getting their education, of our communities. We've already talked about the connection, the co-occurring illness of mental health and substance use disorder. You know, essentially many people are self-medicating to deal with underlying mental health issues that are treatable. And if they had access to affordable care, if they could get access to treatment for anxiety, depression, trauma, one of the reasons, these are all intertwined, by the way. As I was going out and about talking to people about the opioid epidemic, I kept hearing stories, particularly from women, of trauma from sexual assault, sexual abuse, domestic violence. And I realized that they were not getting the treatment and they didn't have the opportunity for recovery from those incidents. And that they were ending up in their life self-medicating, using medication that may have started out a prescription from a physician, but ended up being illicit where they were buying it on the streets and leading to addiction. It's a very vicious cycle. And I try to learn everything I can about that connection of behavioral health, mental health with substance use disorder to try to tailor the federal programs and the funding to tackle those issues together. But yes, we should have absolute parity. Mental health treatment should be readily available. And I'll give you a really good example, and this ties into the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion in New Hampshire. When the fire department in Nashua started the Safe Stations program where people could come in, it sort of broke down the barriers to treatment. People could come in and get access and get connected to treatment for opioid addiction. I remember sitting with the fire chief and we were going over the data from the initial months of that program. Of the first 100 people to walk through the door, over 90 of them were eligible for Medicaid expansion, which was relatively new at that time in New Hampshire. And the point being, they had never had access to healthcare, to mental health, substance use treatment. And when word on the street got out that these people were getting into treatment and that they had coverage through Medicaid expansion, it just ballooned to meet the need that was there. And I think that's very instructive that these are all intertwined. People can't be their best, they can't finish school and do well and get the skills they need and participate in the workforce and participate in the economy and in our civic community experience if they're struggling because they don't have access to healthcare.
When you have a record and you've been in Congress, I guess coming up on 8 years now, then people have something to shoot at. And in past elections, one of the things that's come up in your case has been criticism that you vote with the party too much. The sites that track that sort of thing show that you do vote with Democratic leadership or with the majority of Democrats more than 90% of the time. Can you recall or tell us about a particular issue where you recall breaking from the leadership or the party?
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting, we were having this discussion about those statistics, and you could also look at the statistics of how often I vote in a bipartisan way, and those aren't as easy to get. They don't collect them in the same way. But most of the time, of that 90%, a very high percent, I'd venture to say probably over 80%, are bipartisan bills. Because most of what we do, the CARES Act is a great example. I vote, yes, I'm voting with the speaker, but it turns out I'm also voting with Kevin McCarthy, who is voting for that same bill. So I'll try to get you that information. But yeah, there are definitely times when I vote against my party. And the one that I can think of most notably for the Keene area is the repeal of the, it's called the medical device tax. And it was something that passed before I came to Congress. It was actually passed in the Affordable Care Act. But since I've come to Congress, I have been very active in repealing that, and we were successful in that. Much to the chagrin of Speaker Pelosi. She was quite annoyed. But one of the reasons that I supported the repeal is that I felt that, first of all, it wasn't helpful to healthcare to have a tax on medical devices, because that just falls to patients and the cost of health insurance and therefore to employers. But also, it was important to job creation in New Hampshire. And you may know a company called Smith's Medical in Keene, or right outside of Keene. I visited there several times. It's a big company, high tech, making medical devices, manufacturing very sophisticated medical devices. There's another one up in Lebanon that I visited. I mean, New Hampshire has a number of these companies, and they're really excellent jobs. They're high quality jobs, good benefits, good pay. And it's the kind of thing that New Hampshire is uniquely situated, because we have a long history of high quality manufacturing, but we also have a highly educated workforce that is successful in this medical device industry. So it kind of went hand in hand. What I was was opposed to it philosophically, but it also had a real benefit in my district.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about energy. And in 2018, we talked with you. I think you were a supporter of the idea of the new Green Deal.
I did not sign on to the new Green Deal, but I have put out my own energy plan that we call the Clean Energy Agenda. But there are some overlaps and some differences.
Okay. I was under the impression that you and Chris Pappas had been among those Congress people saying, "Hey, let's put this out there and see what debate it." And
yeah, I don't object to having the whole conversation around climate change and clean energy. I'm a very strong supporter. There were some elements of the original version of that Green New Deal that wasn't the direction that I thought we needed to go. So,
okay.
And that never was really put into a legislative package in any event. What we passed last week, it was pretty extraordinary, and because of all the craziness in the news, really didn't get much coverage. But it will in January when we have a new president. And it was a 900-page bill that tackles all aspects of clean energy and saving our planet, really, from carbon dioxide emissions. And it will be a major boost to our economy. It's about jobs and job creation, and it's about manufacturing and creating jobs here in America. This hasn't been such a big issue in this election, but certainly in past elections, we were talking a lot about job loss overseas. And so, for example, creating clean energy standards for vehicles and appliances, providing incentives for clean energy projects, doing more research on what is the best way to bring down our emissions. Hopefully, President Biden will sign up for the Get Back on Track with the Paris climate talks, and working with our allies around the world and other countries to bring down climate emissions. But it's urgent. You can tell by the fires in California, by the hurricanes on our East Coast, that the threat of climate change is here. It's present. It's happening. I was listening the other day to the scale of the fires in California, and it reminds me. I remember over in Keene, you dealt with the 100-year flood 2 out of 3 years in a row or something. You know, we kept having these big flooding incidents. They're in a similar position with the fires in California. They're called career fires. They're only supposed to happen once in your whole career, and they're happening every single year. So I feel very strongly that we need to take it seriously, listen to the science, and then translate that into new technologies of the 21st century that will really make a difference. One of the biggest is wind energy off the coast of New England. And that's going to be a major investment. Eversource and other companies are very involved. And New England will have a much greater share of clean energy that's, can lower emissions here.
Turning to election security, the president has made some claims about election fraud with mail-in ballots that haven't been substantiated. How do you feel about absentee ballots? And do you think enough has been done at the federal level on election security?
Well, thank you for that. By the way, I was reading the statistic the other day on this, and I don't know if I'll get the number of zeros right, but I think it was 0.0000007. Like it was the same chance of being hit by a meteor was the quote fraud from mail-in ballots. It doesn't hardly exist. So I am a huge fan of both mail-in ballots and what we now have in New Hampshire for the first time, early voting, which means you can go, as I did in the primary, to the town clerk, fill out the application for absentee ballot. They'll hand you a ballot, fill out the ballot, and hand it back. And anytime between now and November 3rd, you will have voted, and it's safe, and you know it's secure, and you know it will be counted. One of the issues that's come up is that this president has done everything in his power to try to interfere with the outcome of the election, starting from just scaring the electorate by saying that he won't accept the results, but even going so far as to slow down the U.S. Postal Service. And Chris Pappas and I had a very good meeting with the Postal Service. We toured the facility down in Nashua where a lot of the sorting is happening. We were assured that absentee ballots will be delivered and counted, but we were told to encourage voters to mail at least 7 days before the election. And if they haven't mailed it 7 days before the election, they should plan to deliver it in person. So what I think can be done is what was in the CARES Act and the legislation we passed, which was funds that were sent to the states to ensure election security. Now, I understand that $3 million came to the state of New Hampshire. I wrote a letter to the Secretary of State asking him how he planned to use those funds to ensure the security of our election. And I haven't heard back from him, but I haven't seen anything in the news either about how those funds are being used. I just came from an event this morning that was about distributing hand sanitizer to election workers. Part of that funding was to be used to make sure that for those people who want to vote in person, they'll be safe from COVID-19. And we have thousands of election workers across the state of New Hampshire. It turned out in the primary, 70% of voters preferred to vote in person on election day, which is fine, that's their prerogative. But I want to make sure that we have PPE, that we have hand sanitizer, that we keep our distance, and that people feel safe to vote. Because if you wait till election day and you get there and it's crowded and you don't feel safe, you won't have another good alternative. So I'm encouraging people to vote early, encouraging people to vote by absentee ballot. We have a unique situation where our state legislature has said that fear of COVID is a sufficient reason to vote absentee. There are stickers on the outside envelope that you send the ballot back with that you have to sign an affidavit. And the sticker indicates that you should sign the affidavit that talks about having a disability, that for purposes of voting this year, fear of COVID is that disability. And I hope that everyone will take this as their civic obligation and opportunity to vote. There's never been a more important election in my lifetime.
Do you have any concerns about election security in other states besides New Hampshire?
I definitely do. There are states, I was just reading, I believe it was North Carolina, where they closed down all of the, there's only one per county for a site to return an absentee ballot rather than having them everywhere. In New Hampshire, we don't have this. We have it by mail or directly to the town clerk. But there are parts of the country where they set up, secure facilities to return ballots, and those all have gotten closed down. I'm definitely concerned, tying back into Mia's question about race. There are tactics that are taken in states like Mississippi and Georgia to discourage people in certain communities from voting. They make it very difficult. The lines are very, very long. I mean, routinely 7 or 8 hour long wait to vote in person. That's unacceptable. And the courts have found that unacceptable in the past, but our US Supreme Court overturned the framework for civil rights and fair elections. And I think that's something that we should revisit when we have a Democratic House, Senate, and President Biden in the White House.
I know in the past you've been very supportive of veterans. Before they were veterans, they were soldiers. So I wanted to ask, with the war in Afghanistan now being the longest conflict in U.S. history, should we be looking towards ending those wars in the Middle East and bringing our troops home, or is there more to do over there?
I absolutely think we should be ending the wars in the Middle East and bringing our troops home. And it's been disappointing that this president has done so little about the peace process. The people on the ground in Afghanistan want to pursue a peace process, and they're making every effort for that to happen. But it takes leadership at the international level from the United States to be a part of convening and supporting and financing a peace process. And I believe that'll be a high priority in a Biden administration, as well as the war in Iraq and the volatility in the entire region. So I like the way you put that. I have been very supportive of veterans, but frankly, I wish there were fewer of them. I wish that we weren't creating more and more veterans with more and more problems, by the way. The complexity of the problems from our modern wars is staggering. I remember serving on the Veterans Affairs Committee. In World War II, a veteran might have 3 different problems, what they called shell shock, sort of the trauma, maybe a hearing problem. And then by Vietnam, they'd have maybe 10 different problems, add in exposure to Agent Orange and all of these other things. Current generation veterans have up to 20 different problems because of the chemical exposures they've had, because of sexual assault in the military, because of the trauma that they've faced. And one of the most significant that we've been tackling, and by the way, Chris Pappas took my seat on the committee, so I stay very involved with Veterans Affairs, is the issue of burn pits. And it's just horrific, but they, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, to deal with the issue of waste, these are very barren lands, they just dig a pit and burn everything. And so that might be computers and chemicals and human waste and waste from the base, from all different aspects. And there's just a big gray cloud of smoke that's extremely toxic. and I've seen photos of it just sitting over the barracks. And sure enough, we have people with really horrific medical conditions based upon this burn pit. And it's just an attitude of waste and not caring for the value of human beings. That's painful, but not unusual in this administration. One of the issues, this is sort of an aside, but important to me, last week I was involved in pulling my colleagues together as a caucus. We got, in the course of a week, 225 members to sign on, and we passed in a resolution condemning the surgeries that are being performed on migrants in Irwin, Georgia, in an ICE detention facility. You may have read about it. And these women were taken to an obstetrician for surgery, and without consent, without clear understanding, sometimes without even a translator to tell them what was happening, there are allegations that complete and partial hysterectomies, sterilization essentially, women that will never be able to have children because of surgeries that were performed on them. And our government is complicit in that. So to me, the callous indifference to human life stands in stark contrast to them wanting to overturn Roe v. Wade and their rush to get Amy Coney Barrett onto the court to do that.
Well, I see we have gotten past our hour, and we're just about finished anyway. So we'll probably wrap things up here. But we certainly appreciate you taking the time to meet with us and let voters in our area and anyone else who wants to tune in have a chance to.
There was one other thing I meant to manage, but we didn't come near it. But just to reference, you probably know about it, but it's called the Northern Borders Regional Commission. And we had doubled the funding and added Cheshire County and Belknap County. And
Right.
Cheshire County was successful in three different, Hannah Grimes got an award, but two very big ones, which was the Entrepreneurial Center, Monadnock Economic Development Center that you have there, $1 million. And then the other one is a water treatment $1 million over where the Millipore Sigma is adding new jobs. Right. So those were very, very significant that we worked hard on. I don't want to miss mentioning those.
Right. I think you were well, not in Jaffrey, but
yeah, we visited. We did visit over there. Yes, in Jaffrey.
Today?
No, not today, but recently when they were applying for the funding and I wanted to understand the project and how it helped create jobs in the region.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I thought you had some kind of event remotely though from there today, right?
Maybe it's still coming this afternoon.
Oh, it could.
I'm not done yet.
Yeah. Well, we do appreciate if people want to find out more about you, they can do that. How?
So there are two websites right now that you can check out. On the campaign side, it's just kusterforcongress.com. And on the official side, it's kuster.house.gov. And so, you can get more information and certainly be in touch with us. I should have mentioned, give a shout out to my staff. At the height of the COVID shutdown, we were fielding 5,000 inquiries a week of letters and phone calls and emails. Primarily, people just were very concerned. They wanted information. I mentioned that we did the 13 town halls, but we have a lot of interaction with our constituents. So feel free to write in, tell us what you need and how we can help.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to Mia and Cecily and Tom. Always good to see you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Bill. Take good
Thank you.
care. Good.
Come on.
Be safe. Wear your mask.